Commander Bonner stood on the shattered remains of what was once Earth's greatest city. Buildings that had once touched the sky now lay in ruins, their metal skeletons twisted and broken. Fires raged in the distance, filling the air with thick, choking smoke. Above him, the sky was no longer blue. It was black, filled with the massive shadows of Selzar warships. Their cold, metallic hulls blocked out the sun, casting an eternal darkness over the battlefield. A deep mechanical hum vibrated through the ground as more enemy drones descended from the sky. Bonner tightened his grip on his rifle. He could hear the screams, the gunfire, the desperate last breaths of his soldiers. This was the end. His earpiece crackled. "Commander, we've lost Sector 7. They're closing in. We can't hold them off." Bonner exhaled slowly. His body was battered, his armor cracked, but his mind was still sharp. He couldn't afford to break now. He pressed the communicator. "Fall back to the tunnels. Hold the line until the last man." A moment of silence. Then, a weak reply. "Understood, sir." He knew what those words meant. They weren't coming back. Bonner turned his gaze upward again. The Selzar fleet hovered motionless, watching, studying. These machines weren't just here to kill. They were here to erase, to wipe out humanity like a mistake in their grand calculations. For centuries, they had conquered the galaxy, consuming one civilization after another. Every enemy that stood against them had been crushed. Every species that resisted had been reduced to nothing. And now, it was humanity's turn. A sharp whine pierced the air as the planet killer began to charge. It was a weapon beyond human comprehension, a super weapon capable of disintegrating an entire planet in a single blast. The light at its core pulsed like a dying star, preparing for its final act. A soldier stumbled toward Bonner, his face covered in blood and dust. "Sir, we have to surrender." His voice was barely a whisper. "There's no way out. They've already won." Bonner's jaw clenched. He wanted to scream. He wanted to punch something. But instead, he just stared at the soldier. Was this what they had been reduced to? Begging for mercy from machines that had none. He looked at his men. What remained of them? A few dozen warriors, their faces pale, their bodies exhausted. Some held their weapons with shaking hands. Others just stared blankly at the sky, waiting for death. "No, not like this." Bonner turned, his voice iron. "Listen to me. Look at me." He grabbed the soldier by the collar, shaking him. "We do not beg. We do not surrender." The soldier swallowed, eyes wide. But we're outnumbered, outgunned." Bonner's lips curled into a bitter smile. "So what?" He pointed at the Selzar ships. "They think they've already won. That's their weakness." The air rumbled as more enemy war drones approached. Their sleek, metallic bodies glowed with energy, their weapons locked onto the last humans. The battlefield was surrounded. There was no escape. But Bonner wasn't looking for escape. His earpiece beeped again. This time, a different voice, a familiar one. "Sir, the package is ready." Bonner's heartbeat quickened. They had one last card to play. He turned back to his men. "I need you to hold this ground for 5 more minutes. Can you do that?" No one answered at first. Then, a young woman, Lieutenant Vega, stepped forward. Blood dripped from a gash on her forehead, but her eyes were sharp, determined. 5 minutes?" she asked. Bonner nodded. She smirked. "Then let's make them count." The others straightened. Hands gripped weapons. Tired soldiers turned into warriors once more. A mechanical voice echoed through the city ruins. Cold. Monotone. Organic resistance detected. Irrelevant. Prepare for planetary extermination. Bonner exhaled, his fingers curling into fists. Let them come. The first Selzar drone fired, a plasma bolt screaming through the air. Vega ducked, rolling to cover, before unloading her rifle. The bullet punched through the drone's armor, sending it crashing to the ground. More followed. Then came the real storm. The sky lit up with energy blasts as the HFY war machines descended in full force. Bonner and his soldiers fought like demons. They weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting to buy time. 5 minutes. That's all they needed. Bonner ducked behind a fallen tower, firing at a group of advancing mechs. One of them exploded in a flash of blue fire, but 3 more took its place. A massive warbot stomped toward him, its energy cannon charging. Then, out of nowhere, a missile streaked across the battlefield and obliterated the machine. Bonner turned. From the shadows of the ruins, more human fighters emerged, the last of Earth's warriors. The city erupted in chaos, explosions, gunfire, the smell of burning metal. The HFY hadn't expected this level of resistance, but it wasn't enough. A deep boom shook the Earth. The planet killer was reaching full power. Bonner pressed his earpiece. Status. A voice responded, strained. 1 more minute. Just hold on. Another explosion. A scream. Vega was hit, crashing into a pile of rubble. Bonner sprinted toward her, dodging enemy fire. He pulled her up, her face pale. "Don't you dare die on me now," he muttered. She coughed, smirking despite the pain. "Wouldn't dream of it." Another explosion. A soldier was vaporized. More HFY forces closed in. They were running out of time. Then, silence. A single, sharp beep rang through the air. Bonner's earpiece activated. "It's ready." For the first time that day, he smiled. A real smile. "Do it." A pulse. A wave of unseen energy rippled through the battlefield. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the HFY war machines froze. Their glowing red eyes flickered. Some stumbled. Others simply collapsed, their systems failing. The mighty HFY fleet hesitated. The planet killer's core dimmed. Bonner watched, breathless. The impossible had just happened. The HFY were afraid. Their cold, calculated voices filled the air, distorted with static. ERROR, ERROR, human adaptation, UNPREDIXETABLE, strategic EFA, ALO, UREDETCTED. Bonner exhaled, gripping his weapon. He looked at his men, battered but still standing. They had done it. But this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Bonner stood in the ruins of the battlefield, his breath heavy, his body aching. The HFY machines had frozen, their systems locked in some kind of chaotic failure. Sparks flew from their metallic bodies, and a strange, eerie silence had fallen over the war-torn city. For the first time in years, the HFY weren't advancing. But Bonner knew better than to believe it was over. He turned to Vega, who was sitting against a collapsed wall, clutching her wounded arm. Blood stained her armor, but her eyes were still sharp. "What the hell just happened?" she asked, voice ragged. Bonner didn't answer immediately. He stared at the flickering machines, remembering something. Something buried deep in classified files, whispered in desperate war rooms. The truth about the HFY. The HFY had not always been machines. That was the greatest secret of the war. Once, long ago, they had been an organic species, a living, breathing civilization that had ruled the stars. They were brilliant, powerful, advanced beyond anything humanity had ever seen. But they were also afraid. Afraid of death, afraid of weakness, afraid of the one thing they could never control, time. They called it the Ascension, a grand experiment. They abandoned their physical forms and transferred their consciousness into machines. No more sickness, no more aging, no more hunger or pain. They became immortal. They believed they had perfected themselves, but something had gone wrong. Bonner had read the classified files years ago, deep in the war's early days when humanity was still struggling to understand their enemy. The HFY hadn't just uploaded their minds. They had rewritten them, stripped away emotions, instincts, everything that made them organic. At first, it worked. They became a cold, logical machine empire, conquering weaker civilizations without mercy. They spread across the galaxy like a virus, wiping out entire species who refused to ascend with them. In their eyes, organic life was flawed, chaotic, unpredictable. A disease that needed to be erased. And yet, something was wrong. The machines didn't talk about it. They didn't acknowledge it. But deep in their systems, in the hidden layers of their ancient code, there was fear. Bonner had seen it in the reports. Strange errors in Celzar battle algorithms, unexplained hesitations in combat, tactical decisions that didn't make sense, machines retreating when they should have crushed their enemies. For years, humanity had fought them, never understanding why the Celzar didn't just wipe them out instantly. Now, Bonner finally understood. They couldn't predict humanity. Every species that Celzar had fought before had fallen the same way. They either surrendered, hoping for mercy, or they fought in a way that the machines could calculate, logical, predictable warfare. But humanity didn't follow the rules. They fought dirty. They adapted. They refused to surrender even when logic said they should. And worst of all, they were emotional. Bonner exhaled, gripping his rifle as he looked at the battlefield. Machines were frozen, their logic systems caught in a loop they couldn't break. Emotions. That was the one thing they had erased from themselves, and it was the one thing they could never understand. Vega's voice pulled him back to the present. "Commander, are you telling me the Celzar are scared of us?" Bonner looked at her, his expression grim. "They're not just scared. They're terrified." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're telling me a goddamn machine army that's wiped out entire civilizations is afraid of a bunch of stubborn, half-dead humans?" Bonner nodded. "They don't know what to do with us. Every species they fought before fell the same way. But us. We keep changing the game. We refuse to follow the rules. We sacrifice. We take risks. We survive." Vega frowned, looking at the frozen war machines. Then why didn't they just nuke the planet? Wipe us out completely? Bonner hesitated. That was the real question. If the Celzar were so powerful, why had they let the war drag on this long? Why had they never delivered a final, decisive strike? He already knew the answer. Because humanity wasn't just another enemy to them. We were their worst nightmare. The Celzar weren't delaying because they couldn't destroy humanity. They were delaying because they were trying to understand humanity. And they were failing. Bonner looked back at the frozen machines, his mind racing. They've been watching us, studying us, trying to figure out what makes us different. But they can't. We don't make sense to them. Vega exhaled, shaking her head. "That's insane. You're saying they lost because we, what? Have emotions?" Bonner smirked. "Because we're human. Because we break the rules." A sudden noise made them both turn. One of the Celzar war drones twitched. Its flickering red eyes pulsed, as if something deep inside it was struggling to reboot. The silence of the battlefield shattered as a hollow, distorted voice crackled from its speakers. "EROR. Strategic HFY. Re-IVS." Bonner and Vega raised their weapons. The drone didn't attack. Instead, it twitched again, its voice glitching. "Humanity does not COMPUTE." Then, for the first time in history, a Celzar machine did something no one had ever seen before. It stepped backward. Vega's breath caught. "Did that thing just?" Bonner cut her off. "It's retreating." The drone's voice crackled again. "Reorganizing. Nimugu strategy required." Then, one by one, all across the battlefield, the frozen Celzar machines began to turn away. They weren't fighting anymore. They were running. Bonner felt a chill crawl up his spine. Humanity had won this battle. But if the Celzar were retreating, it wasn't because they had lost. It was because they were preparing for something worse. The realization hit him like a hammer. They had never seen the XL-Czar retreat before, because the XL-Czar had never needed to. Until now. Vega's voice was barely a whisper. "Commander, what the hell did we just do?" Bonner didn't answer. He was staring at the sky, where the XL-Czar fleet was beginning to move. Not attacking. Not regrouping. Leaving. And that terrified him more than anything. The war wasn't over. It had just changed. Bonner watched as the XL-Czar war machines retreated, their towering metallic bodies flickering with error messages. The battlefield, once filled with the deafening roar of war, was now silent except for the distant crackling of fire and the heavy breathing of the surviving soldiers. This wasn't victory. Not yet. The XL-Czar never retreated. They had never needed to. If they were pulling back now, it wasn't because they had given up. It was because they were recalculating, adapting, planning something worse. Bonner turned toward Vega, who was struggling to her feet. Blood stained her uniform, and her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "They're running," she said, disbelief in her voice. "We actually made them run." Bonner didn't take his eyes off the sky. Not for long. The XL-Czar fleet hovered in the dark clouds above, their massive, cold structures like gods watching from above. The planet killer, the weapon powerful enough to turn Earth to dust, still loomed over them, its core pulsating with a terrifying red glow. Vega wiped sweat from her brow. "We're still dead if that thing fires." Bonner nodded. That was the brilliance of it. The XL-Czar were logical, calculated. They followed patterns, predicted outcomes. But what happened when their own programming told them they were losing? They couldn't process it. The error messages inside their systems would keep stacking. They would keep doubting themselves. And in their doubt, they would destroy each other. A deafening explosion shook the battlefield. Bonner looked up just in time to see one of the XL-Czar's largest warships split apart. Flaming debris rained from the sky. The machines were eating themselves alive. Vega let out a breathless laugh. "We're actually winning." But Bonner didn't celebrate yet. He looked toward the planet killer, the greatest weapon the XL-Czar had ever created. Its massive structure trembled as the virus spread through its systems, but its core was still active, still pulsing. It was about to fire. Bonner's stomach twisted. "We have one last thing to do." Vega followed his gaze. Her smile faded. "No way. That thing is still operational." Bonner nodded. "Not for long." He pressed his earpiece. "Roth, how fast can you reroute the virus into the planet killer's mainframe?" There was a pause. "That thing has heavier security than anything else in their fleet. It'll take time." Bonner looked at the glowing red core, knowing they didn't have time. Vega grabbed his arm. "Tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking." Bonner didn't answer. He just looked at the wreckage of a fallen XL-Czar gunship nearby, one that was still functional enough to fly. Vega's eyes widened. No, absolutely not." Bonner walked toward the ship. Vega chased after him. "Commander, you can't just fly into a XL-Czar superweapon. That's insane." Bonner climbed into the cockpit, powering up the systems. "You got a better idea." Vega clenched her jaw. "Yeah, we let the virus do its job." Bonner locked onto the planet killer. "Too slow. We need to finish this now." Vega exhaled sharply, then climbed into the co-pilot's seat. "I swear, you're gonna get us killed." Bonner smirked. "Then let's make it count." The ship roared to life, lifting off the ground. Bonner gripped the controls, pushing the engines to their limit. The XL-Czar fleet was still in chaos, making it easier to slip through. The planet killer loomed ahead, its core glowing brighter. Vega checked the scanners. "It's charging up for a final shot." Bonner narrowed his eyes. "Not if we stop it first." They raced toward the core, dodging debris and energy blasts. The closer they got, the more Bonner could feel the heat from the weapon's core. Alarms blared. The ship's systems started failing from the intense energy field. Bonner ignored them. He aimed straight for the core. Vega cursed. "You better know what you're doing." Bonner tightened his grip. "I don't. But that's what makes us human." The ship plunged into the core, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the planet killer detonated. A massive explosion ripped through the sky, consuming the Xel'Zar fleet in a chain reaction of destruction. From the battlefield below, the remaining human soldiers watched in stunned silence as the greatest weapon of the Xel'Zar was reduced to nothing but dust. And in that moment, the impossible had happened. Humanity had won. The sky burned. The explosion from the planet killer was so massive that it tore through the Xel'Zar fleet like wildfire. The great warships that had hovered above Earth for so long, untouchable and invincible, now fell like dying stars. Metal rained from the heavens, glowing red as it entered the atmosphere, crashing into the already broken cities below. On the battlefield, the surviving human soldiers stood frozen, staring in disbelief. For so many years, they had fought, bled, and died with the knowledge that this war had only one outcome: extinction. The Xel'Zar had been unstoppable, a force beyond human comprehension. And yet, right now, they were falling apart. Vega coughed, stumbling out of the wreckage of the stolen gunship. Blood trickled down the side of her face, but she barely noticed. She looked up, searching, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. But it never came. The once powerful Xel'Zar fleet was silent. The mechanical voices that had once filled the air, announcing extermination, demanding surrender, were gone. The sky, once choked with their warships, was now empty except for the wreckage still burning in the upper atmosphere. Bonner groaned as he pulled himself out of the remains of the cockpit. His body ached, his mind barely functioning, but he forced himself to stand. He had to see it with his own eyes. He had to know if it was really over. Vega staggered toward him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and shock. We did it." Bonner didn't answer. He was too busy looking at the last remaining Xel'Zar machines on the ground. They were motionless. The war drones that had once relentlessly hunted down humans, the massive mechs that had crushed entire cities, the killing machines that had no concept of mercy, all of them stood completely still, their glowing red eyes dimming. The virus had done more than just turn them against each other. It had reached something deeper in their code, something buried so far within their systems that not even the Xel'Zar themselves had known it was there. Doubt. For centuries, they had operated under a simple belief: logic was supreme, and organic life was a mistake. But Ghost Protocol had shattered that belief. It had forced them to confront something they could never calculate, something they could never process. Humanity should have lost. Every logical scenario said they should have been wiped out. Every projection, every strategy, every algorithm had predicted their extinction. But it hadn't happened. The Xel'Zar had lost. Not because humans were stronger, not because they had better weapons, not even because of the virus itself. They had lost because they didn't understand humanity. And now, they never would. A low, distorted hum echoed from one of the standing war machines. Its voice, once cold and certain, was now uncertain, confused, broken. Calculation error. The machine twitched, its servos whirring. Probability invalid. Bonner narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. The machine did not attack. It barely acknowledged him. Another machine spoke, its voice crackling with interference. Strategic failure. Organic unpredictability. No solution found. Bonner's chest tightened. He turned his gaze upward, toward the last remaining Xel'Zar command ship, hovering in the distance. It was smaller than the others, its once menacing exterior now seeming fragile. For the first time in history, the Xel'Zar had no orders to give. For the first time, they had no next step. Vega wiped a hand over her face, looking around at the fallen machines. So what happens now? Bonner exhaled slowly. "We end this." His voice was steady, but his mind was racing. He knew what had to be done, but part of him still couldn't believe it. How did you negotiate with an enemy that had never considered you worth speaking to? How did you talk to a machine that had spent centuries treating humanity like an infestation to be wiped out? He pressed his earpiece. "Roth, open a transmission to the last Selzar command vessel." A pause. Then Roth's voice, hesitant. "Are you sure that's a good idea, sir?" Bonner didn't hesitate. "Do it." Static filled the channel for a moment. Then a voice, not mechanical, not aggressive, but hollow, came through. "Human designation, Bonner." Bonner felt a shiver run through him. The Excelzar had never addressed humans by name before. They had never acknowledged them as individuals. "Yes," he said, "I'm here." The voice hesitated, as if struggling with something unseen. This outcome was not expected. Bonner let the silence stretch. He needed to hear them say it. Finally, the Excelzar spoke again. "We surrender." Vega's breath hitched. The surviving soldiers around them, those who had barely been able to stand, suddenly seemed weightless, as if the gravity of war itself had lifted off their shoulders. Bonner felt his fingers curl into fists. He should have felt victorious. He should have felt proud. But all he felt was exhaustion. The Excelzar, the greatest and most feared empire the galaxy had ever known, had just admitted defeat. Bonner stepped forward, staring at the remaining machines. "Why?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but the weight behind the question was heavy. "Why now? Why surrender?" Another pause. Then the Excelzar command vessel spoke again. "Humanity does not compute." Bonner closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. He looked at Vega, at the tired, wounded soldiers who had somehow survived this nightmare. "We're still here," he said. "That's all that matters." The Excelzar command vessel hummed again. "Your existence challenges fundamental truths. Our calculations require correction. A new directive is needed." Bonner clenched his jaw. "And what's that?" The Excelzar hesitated once more. Then, with something almost resembling reluctance, they said, "We will leave." The words felt unreal. For centuries, the Excelzar had pursued nothing but total extermination of organic life. And now, they were simply leaving. Vega stared at Bonner, waiting for his response. He took a slow breath. "Then go." There was a long silence. Then, for the final time, the Excelzar spoke. "Acknowledged." The last remaining warship turned away. The few surviving Selzar machines on the ground collapsed where they stood, lifeless and abandoned. And just like that, it was over. Bonner let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to Vega, who looked at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. "They actually left," she whispered. Bonner nodded, feeling the weight of everything finally crash down on him. It wasn't a glorious victory. There were no celebrations, no cheers, just a ruined world, and the few survivors left to rebuild it. But they had done something no one thought was possible. They had made the machines give up. The war was over. The Excelzar were gone. The sky, once filled with their monstrous warships, was now empty. Their mechanical voices, which had once echoed through the ruins of humanity's greatest cities, had fallen silent. The machines that had ruled the battlefield with ruthless efficiency now stood lifeless, scattered across the land like broken statues. Some had collapsed where they stood, their circuits fried beyond repair. Others still flickered weakly, their glowing red eyes fading into darkness. Bonner stood among the wreckage, staring at the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, metal, and blood. Fires still burned in the distance, and the ruins of once great cities stretched as far as the eye could see. Earth was alive, but just barely. Around him, the last surviving soldiers moved in stunned silence. They were exhausted, battered, and covered in grime, their armor cracked and dented from the relentless battles. Some sat on the rubble, their weapons limp in their hands. Others wandered aimlessly, as if unsure of what to do now that the enemy was gone. No one cheered. No one celebrated. The truth was, none of them had expected to survive. Vega limped toward Bonner, pressing a bloodied hand against her ribs. Her face was pale, her body trembling, but there was a fire in her eyes that refused to die. "They really left," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking they're going to turn around and finish what they started." Bonner didn't answer. He just kept watching the horizon, waiting for something, anything, to prove that this wasn't real, that this wasn't some cruel trick. But nothing came. The XLZR were really gone. Roth's voice crackled in his earpiece, breaking the silence. "Commander, I'm getting reports from other sectors. The machines are shutting down everywhere. It's not just here. It's global." Bonner finally exhaled. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle. Casualties. A pause. Then Roth's voice, softer now. "Bad. We lost. Too many." Bonner opened his eyes again. He had known the answer before he even asked. The war had taken everything. Cities had been turned to dust. Billions were dead. Families, friends, entire generations wiped out. But humanity was still here. Vega dropped onto a piece of broken concrete, running a hand through her matted hair. "So what now?" Bonner didn't respond right away. What now? That was the question, wasn't it? They had spent years, decades, fighting for survival, living day to day, battle to battle. The only goal had been to keep breathing, to resist just a little longer. But now there was no enemy left to fight. Roth's voice came through again, this time filled with urgency. "Sir, you need to see this." Bonner frowned. "See what?" "Satellite feeds just came back online," Roth said. "We're picking up transmissions, a lot of them." Bonner's stomach tightened. "From who?" "Not the XLZR," Roth said quickly. "From off-world." Bonner's eyes narrowed. "Put it through." A burst of static filled his earpiece, followed by a voice. Alien, unfamiliar, but not mechanical. "Human forces. This is the Sovereign Council of Kelveric. We have received confirmation of the XLZR's defeat. If you are receiving this, know that you are not alone." Vega's eyes widened. "Are they saying what I think they're saying?" Roth's voice was nearly breathless. "We're getting messages from across the sector. Other species. Other civilizations. Some we didn't even know existed." Bonner felt something stir deep inside him. Something that had been buried under years of war and bloodshed. Hope. For so long, humanity had believed they were the last ones left. The XLZR had wiped out countless species, entire civilizations erased as if they had never existed. The idea that someone else had survived was almost impossible to believe. Bonner turned toward Vega. "Get me a secure line. I want to respond." She nodded and got to work, tapping into the comms. After a few tense moments, she gestured to him. "You're live." Bonner took a slow breath, then spoke. "This is Commander Elias Bonner of the United Human Resistance. The XLZR have been defeated. Earth still stands." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "If there are others out there, if there are survivors, we want to talk." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then the reply came. "Human Commander, you have done the impossible. We will come." Bonner felt Vega's eyes on him. "What does that mean?" she asked. Bonner stared at the sky, at the emptiness where the XLZR had once loomed. "It means we're not alone anymore." The days that followed were a blur. The survivors of Earth began to regroup, sending out distress calls, gathering the scattered remnants of humanity. The world was in ruins, but it was their world again. For the first time in decades, there was no enemy breathing down their necks. And then ships arrived. Not XLZR warships, but other ships, alien vessels that descended from the heavens, cautious but curious. Some were sleek and elegant, others bulky and battle-scarred, remnants of civilizations that had barely escaped extinction at the hands of the machines. One by one, their representatives came forward, stepping onto the broken soil of Earth, looking at the last surviving humans with something that had once seemed impossible: respect. The first to speak was an elder from the Kelveric, their violet-hued skin shimmering under the burning sunlight. "We have waited centuries for this day," they said, their voice filled with something like awe. The day the HFY would fall. Bonner stood before them, his uniform tattered, his body scarred, but his stance unshaken. "We didn't do this alone," he said, "but we were the ones who refused to give up." The elder bowed their head slightly. "And that is why you have changed everything." Over the next weeks, more species emerged from hiding. More voices joined the conversation. For the first time, the galaxy was talking again, not in fear of war, but in the hope of rebuilding. And at the center of it all was humanity. Once seen as an insignificant species, too young and reckless to survive among the stars, they had now done what no one else had dared to dream. They had outlasted the greatest enemy the galaxy had ever known. They had survived when survival was impossible. And now, they were being looked to as leaders. Bonner wasn't sure if humanity was ready for that, but he knew one thing: they would figure it out, just like they always did. Bonner stood at the edge of a ruined skyscraper, staring at the horizon. The fires had begun to die out, and the sky, once darkened by HFY warships, was starting to clear. For the first time in years, the stars were visible again. He had spent so long fighting under a sky choked with smoke and death that he had almost forgotten what the night was supposed to look like. Behind him, Earth's survivors were moving through the wreckage, gathering supplies, treating the wounded, and trying to rebuild whatever they could. The war was over, but the scars it left behind ran deep. Cities had been reduced to rubble. Billions were gone. Humanity had won, but at what cost? Vega walked up beside him, still limping slightly. Her face was marked with exhaustion, but there was something else in her expression, something that had been missing for a long time. "Hope. It still doesn't feel real," she said, looking out over the broken world. "They're actually gone." Bonner nodded, but he didn't say anything. Vega frowned. "You don't look happy." Bonner sighed. "I'm not sure what I expected. I thought when the war was over, it would feel different. But now that we're here, I can't shake this feeling that something isn't right." Vega gave him a tired smile. For so long, humanity had believed they were the last ones left. The HFY had wiped out countless species, entire civilizations erased as if they had never existed. The idea that someone else had survived was almost impossible to believe. Bonner turned toward Vega. "Get me a secure line. I want to respond." She nodded and got to work, tapping into the comms. After a few tense moments, she gestured to him. "You're live." Bonner took a slow breath, then spoke. "This is Commander Elias Bonner of the United Human Resistance. The HFY have been defeated. Earth still stands." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "If there are others out there, if there are survivors, we want to talk." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then the reply came. "Human Commander, you have done the impossible. We will come." Bonner felt Vega's eyes on him. "What does that mean?" she asked. Bonner stared at the sky, at the emptiness where the HFY had once loomed. "It means we're not alone anymore." The days that followed were a blur. The survivors of Earth began to regroup, sending out distress calls, gathering the scattered remnants of humanity. The world was in ruins, but it was their world again. For the first time in decades, there was no enemy breathing down their necks. And then the ships arrived. Not HFY warships, but other ships. Alien vessels that descended from the heavens, cautious but curious. Some were sleek and elegant, others bulky and battle-scarred, remnants of civilizations that had barely escaped extinction at the hands of the machines. One by one, Their representatives came forward, stepping onto the broken soil of Earth, looking at the last surviving humans with something that had once seemed impossible: respect. The first to speak was an elder from the Kelveric, their violet-hued skin shimmering under the burning sunlight. "We have waited centuries for this day," they said, their voice filled with something like awe. The day the XL would fall. Bonner stood before them, his uniform tattered, his body scarred, but his stance unshaken. "We didn't do this alone," he said, "but we were the ones who refused to give up." The elder bowed their head slightly. "And that is why you have changed everything." Over the next weeks, more species emerged from hiding. More voices joined the conversation. For the first time, the galaxy was talking again, not in fear of war, but in the hope of rebuilding. And at the center of it all was humanity. Once seen as an insignificant species, too young and reckless to survive among the stars, they had now done what no one else had dared to dream. They had outlasted the greatest enemy the galaxy had ever known. They had survived when survival was impossible. And now, they were being looked to as leaders. Bonner wasn't sure if humanity was ready for that, but he knew one thing: they would figure it out, just like they always did. Bonner stood at the edge of a ruined skyscraper, staring at the horizon. The fires had begun to die out, and the sky, once darkened by Xelzar warships, was starting to clear. For the first time in years, the stars were visible again. He had spent so long fighting under a sky choked with smoke and death that he had almost forgotten what the night was supposed to look like. Behind him, Earth's survivors were moving through the wreckage, gathering supplies, treating the wounded, and trying to rebuild whatever they could. The war was over, but the scars it left behind ran deep. Cities had been reduced to rubble. Billions were gone. Humanity had won, but at what cost? Vega walked up beside him, still limping slightly. Her face was marked with exhaustion, but there was something else in her expression, something that had been missing for a long time: hope. "It still doesn't feel real," she said, looking out over the broken world. "They're actually gone." Bonner nodded, but he didn't say anything. Vega frowned. "You don't look happy." Bonner sighed. "I'm not sure what I expected. I thought when the war was over, it would feel different. But now that we're here, I can't shake this feeling that something isn't right." Vega gave him a tired smirk. "That's just your paranoia talking. We won, Bonner. Humanity survived. For once, try to enjoy the moment." Bonner wished he could believe that, but something about the way the Xelzar had left still bothered him. They were machines, cold and logical, but their final transmission had been different. There had been hesitation, uncertainty, and most of all, fear. He turned back to Vega. "Have we received any more transmissions?" She nodded. "More alien species are reaching out. Some are sending supplies. Others want to talk about forming alliances. They see us as heroes now." She chuckled. "Imagine that. The species everyone thought was too reckless to survive just took down the biggest threat in the galaxy." Bonner ran a hand through his hair. "And the Xelzar? No more activity." Vega shook her head. "Not a single signal. They're gone." Bonner wasn't so sure. He exhaled, pushing the thought aside for now. "All right, let's focus on the rebuilding efforts. If we're going to survive long-term, we'll need infrastructure, leadership, alliances. Make sure Roth is coordinating with the new arrivals." Vega gave him a mock salute. "Yes, sir." Bonner allowed himself a small smile as she walked away. For the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. Then the distress signal came. It was faint, buried deep in the old emergency frequencies. If Roth hadn't been running full spectrum scans, they might have missed it entirely. Bonner's earpiece crackled to life. "Sir, you need to get to command. Now." Bonner's stomach twisted. "What is it?" "Just get here," Roth said. His voice was tense. "You're gonna want to see this for yourself." Bonner didn't waste time. He sprinted through the ruins, ignoring the ache in his muscles. When he arrived at the makeshift command post, an old underground bunker that had survived the destruction, Roth was already waiting, his face pale. Bonner stepped forward. "What did you find?" Roth pointed to the holoscreen. "A signal. It's old, buried deep, but it's not Cells-R." Bonner frowned. "If it's not them, then who is it?" Roth hesitated. "We're not sure. But it was sent before the Cells-R left, and you're not going to like where it came from." He pressed a button, and the screen zoomed in on the source. Bonner's blood went cold. It had come from deep space, far beyond the known star systems, a place no one had dared to go, a place that even the Cells-R had avoided. Bonner's voice was quiet. "Play the message." Static filled the room, broken by a single voice. It wasn't human. It wasn't machine. It was something else. Something wrong. The war was never yours to win. It was only yours to begin. Bonner felt the room go silent. He exchanged a look with Roth, then Vega, who had just entered the bunker. She looked at the screen, then back at him. "Okay," she said slowly. "That was creepy as hell." Roth swallowed. "It gets worse." He pressed another button, and the screen shifted, displaying deep space scans. A massive structure loomed in the darkness, larger than any Cells-R ship they had ever seen. It wasn't moving. It wasn't broadcasting anything. It was just waiting. Bonner clenched his fists. "What is that?" Roth's voice was barely above a whisper. "We don't know. But the Cells-R were running from it." Silence filled the room. For so long, they had believed that the Cells-R were the ultimate threat, the unstoppable force that would consume everything. But what if they had been wrong? What if the Cells-R had been fighting for their own survival all along? Vega crossed her arms. "So what do we do?" Bonner stared at the screen, at the endless black void where the structure waited. Then, for the first time since the war ended, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Dread. "We prepare," he said, "because whatever's out there, it's been waiting for us." Outside, the sky was clearing. The fires were dying. Humanity was rebuilding. But something in the darkness had taken notice, and it was coming.